Welcome back to another brand new You Don't Know Sports podcast here on the 9th of September, 2024. I am your host, SlimmDa Kid, and I personally want to thank you for tuning into this brand new podcast. We had two new podcasts in You Don't Know Sports last week. College football is in full swing, and we decided to give you some of the more incredible stories and facts that we could find about college football. We're going to continue that trend this week with 15 more amazing college football stories that you may or may not have heard about. We here at You Don't Know Sports are proud to give you this two-part episode, so be sure to keep your eyes and ears open for part 2 coming out later this afternoon. Here we go. 1918, the influenza pandemic and the world at war. A lot happened in 2020, and that has been compared to 1918, including the college football season. The influenza pandemic forced cancellations of many games, and that was on top of World War I taking a lot of college-age kids to the battlefield. Military organizations fielded teams made up of former college players to play against collegiate games. For example, former Illinois player and future Chicago Bears legend George Halas played for the Great Lakes Naval Training Station during this period. The combination of those two events nearly put a stop to the sport in October, the season's first month in those years. With the easing of war restrictions and quarantines ending, college football kicked into high gear in November. Students were back in school and programs filled schedules on the fly. Michigan and Pittsburgh would end up splitting the national championship. Some big names to note in 1918, Georgia Tech's John Heisman, Pittsburgh's Pop Warner, and Notre Dame's backfield of Curly Lambeau and George Gipp. This was also Knute Rockne's first season as head coach of the Fighting Irish. (1936) Slippery Rock, national champion. The 1936 season was the first that the AP, that is the Associated Press, would select a national champion. It was Minnesota. But there was some other, less-known media that would make this a crazy season. A story arose that used the tentative property of winning to declare tiny Slippery Rock the national champion. It follows like this. Slippery Rock beat Westminster, who beat West Virginia Wesleyan, who beat DeQuince, who beat Pitt, who beat Notre Dame, who beat Northwestern, who beat AP champion Minnesota. Slippery Rock, who finished 6-3 and competed in the Pennsylvania State Teachers Conference and their satirical championship, quote-unquote, was picked up by National Wire Services, a 1936 version of going viral, and became a running joke in college football for years. Even today, Slippery Rock scores will be announced by public address announcers and find their way into papers and websites. 1943, World War II. With the nation in the thick of World War II, much of college football was shut down. 8 SEC schools, including Alabama, Florida, and Auburn, didn't have a team that season. The Pacific Coast Conference saw many of its members sit out. The schools that did play staggered the starts to their seasons and created vast differences in the amount of games played, similar to what happened in 2020. There were travel restrictions due to rationing and various sacrifices made to accommodate the war effort that affected the college football season. The Associated Press did include service schools in their polls for the first time, as the War Department promoted teams made up from players on their training bases and flight schools. In 1943, the most successful ones were Iowa Pre-Flight, Marshfield, Bainbridge, and Great Lakes Navy. In fact, Great Lakes Navy would beat number 1 Notre Dame in the season finale, though the Irish would still be voted number 1 in the final polls. Notre Dame. The Irish beat the number 2 ranked team twice, Michigan and Iowa pre-flight, and the number 3 ranked team twice, both Army and Navy, respectively, to complete one of the toughest schedules in college football history. 1960, Missouri's loss that didn't happen. Iowa opened the season beating 5 ranked opponents in 6 weeks and ascended to the number 1 ranking. They would lose to number 3 Minnesota, then blowing out number 3 Ohio State and Notre Dame to end the season. Iowa's loss was Missouri's gain as the Tigers took the number 1 ranking into their final regular season game with Kansas. The Jayhawks blasted Mizzou 23-7, but the Big 8 ruled Kansas halfback Burt Cohn ineligible due to a recruiting violation when Cohn was at Texas Christian University. Kansas forfeited the game, and Missouri's loss was erased by the Big 8 Conference. The NCAA counted the game as a Kansas victory and thus knocked Missouri from the number 1 ranking. Minnesota, despite losing to Purdue and beating only 2 ranked teams, would end up winning the AP National Championship by a few votes over Mississippi and Iowa. The Gophers received 17.5 first-place votes to the Rebels' 16 and the Iowa Hawkeyes' 12.5. Missouri, despite its loss being reversed and finishing undefeated, finished 5th in the final poll and received 0 first-place votes. In those days, the final polls happened prior to bowl games, so Minnesota was named champion before losing the Rose Bowl to Washington. Missouri would go on to beat Navy in the Orange Bowl. 1966, the game of the century ended in a tie. The 1966 season is one of the more controversial years in college football, primarily by how the champion was crowned. Alabama was the defending 2-time champion and began the season ranked number 1. Despite not playing in week 1 of the season, the Crimson Tide dropped to number 4 in the following poll. Alabama would go on to an 11-0 record, the only undefeated and united record in college football. Untied record in college football, and included spanking number 6 Nebraska in the Sugar Bowl. Yet the Tide would finish the season ranked number 3. The 2 top spots would go to Notre Dame and Michigan State, who played a, quote, game of the century in East Lansing, Michigan. There was an outcry that ABC would not televise the game nationally due to NCAA rules. The network would get around this rule by showing the game in every state but 2 and naming it a regional telecast. With the score 10-10 late in the game, Notre Dame would run out the clock to preserve the tie. After that game, the AP named Notre Dame number 1 while the coaches poll had Michigan State in the top spot. The Spartans' season was over, but Notre Dame would go to Los Angeles and bludgeon USC 51-0. Both schools would finish 9-0-1, with Notre Dame refusing to play bowl games and Michigan State ineligible to play in the Rose Bowl due to their trip the previous season. Notre Dame would be voted number 1 by both polls. 3 of the top 5 teams didn't play in a bowl, and the Heisman Trophy winner, Steve Spurrier, wasn't on national television during the regular season. 1983, the U comes out of nowhere. The University of Miami was a middling program until Howard Schnellberger came along in 1979, making their 1983 national championship appearing out of nowhere. After going 7-4 the previous season, the Hurricanes entered 1983 unranked and didn't enter the ranking system until week 5. They shot up the polls and eventually reached number 5, entering their Orange Bowl showdown with dominant number 1 Nebraska, who averaged 52 points per game that season. The game was close throughout, with the Cornhuskers scoring a touchdown with less than a minute remaining to trail 31-30. Instead of kicking the extra point to tie the game, Nebraska went for two and the win. Miami broke up the pass and toppled the Huskers. With number 2 and number 4 Illinois losing their bowl games, Miami leaped over number 3 Auburn in the rankings and won their first national championship, leading to complaints from the Tigers and the SEC. Auburn, featuring Bo Jackson, had beaten number 4 Georgia, number 5 Florida, number 7 Maryland, number 8 Michigan, and number 19 Alabama during the season. Miami had only beaten 2 ranked teams, Notre Dame, who came in at number 13, and West Virginia, who came in at number 12 before their Orange Bowl win. It also wouldn't happen in today's game, as Nebraska and Texas dominated the top of the rankings, but would play in separate bowl games, as was the norm at the time. Miami wouldn't have even made the current college football playoff format if it would have existed at this time. 1984, BYU wins a national championship and a Hail Mary. In the current college football playoff era, it seems next to impossible for a team outside of the power conferences to win a national championship. In 1984, it was possible, as a BYU team that won a whack and every other team lost at least 4 games would capture college football's biggest prize. BYU played just one ranked team, number 3 Pittsburgh, in the opener, and however, this team would finish the season a disappointing 3-7-1. None of the other top-ranked teams would bother to play BYU in the lesser Holiday Bowl, so the Cougars faced 6-5 Michigan instead. BYU would win, and as the land's only unbeaten team, would finish number 1 in both polls. Being number 1 was unlucky that season. Number 1 Auburn lost to Miami in the Kickoff Classic. A week later, newly minted number 1 Miami would lose to Michigan. 3 weeks later, number 1 Nebraska lost to Syracuse. Number 1 Texas tied Oklahoma in the Red River Shootout on a controversial missed call. Washington and Nebraska, again, had their terms at number 1, but would lose as well. BYU, despite its easy schedule, would win its first national championship. Oh, and this was the same year as that Doug Flutie Hail Mary, too. That is the end of part 1 and the college football stories that you may or may not have known about. I am your host, SlimmDa Kid. Be sure to listen to part 2 as we continue our trend and keeping college football fresh and relevant with stories and facts that you may or may not have known about.